right, today we are going to be talking about the American Revolution. America is no longer part of the colonies, but instead is forming its own nation and its own identity. Down with the crown, go Patriots. I don't mean the football team. I don't like the football team, Patriots. That's beside the point. Anyway, the American Revolution. So by 1776, the colonists had lost, Britain had lost full control of the colonies. And there was a couple different parties that were involved in this. That would be the Loyalists, the Patriots, and the country of France, specifically King Louis. However, despite Loyalist opposition, as well as Great Britain's apparently overwhelming military and financial advantages, the Patriot cause succeeded because of the actions of colonial militias and the Continental Army, George Washington's military leadership, and the colonialist ideological commitment of resilience and the assistance of the European ally of France. France is essential to helping the U.S. victory. So, a couple of the things we need to go over. One is the First Continental Congress. So we left off with, after the Boston Massacre and the implementation of the Intolerable Acts or Coercive Acts, a group of delegates was chosen to meet at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1774. You had good old Georgia that didn't send anybody. They were still heavily loyal to the crown. Also of note, under the Coercive Acts, it made any meetings illegal, and so this First Continental Congress was definitely illegal. But their full desires of the First Continental Congress was to resolve the relationship with the crown. They did not want to have a revolution. They did not want to gain independence. They simply wanted to restore the relationship that they had with the crown as Englishmen, because they did definitely see themselves as Englishmen. Even those delegates from Massachusetts were still willing to reconcile. However, they were some of the ones that were more rowdy and caused more discontent within the First Continental Congress. They were the most oppressed colony, considering their actions and how it had gotten to the point of the Intolerable Acts. So the First Continental Congress had a couple of different plans. You had the Galloway Plan. This was very, very similar to the Albany Plan. If you remember the Albany Congress that we talked about that met in 1754. So the main features of the Galloway Plan included creating a centralized colonial government called the Grand Council. The Grand Council would have a president that would be appointed by the crown, and a representative from each colony, or representation. I don't remember. Nope, I shouldn't say that. Shoot. Okay, I'll cut that. 3, 2, 1. So the main feature of the Galloway Plan included creating a centralized colonial government called the Grand Council. It would have a president like... The main feature of the Galloway Plan included creating a centralized colonial government called the Grand Council. It would have a presidential position that would be appointed by the crown, as well as representation from each of the colonies. This council would have the authority to govern colonial matters, manage defense, regulate trade, and handle restrictions with Native Americans. However, ultimately, as good as this plan sounds for the colonists and maybe even potentially for the crown, the First Continental Congress could not agree to this. Most of the delegates rejected this idea because they wanted to find a more radical approach toward addressing their grievances. This plan didn't really have any foundations for changing the way things were. So the group in Massachusetts called the Suffolk, from Suffolk County in Massachusetts, came up with a plan that they tried sending to Congress, but it was also ended up being rejected. The Suffolk plan, Hull's point was to overturn the Massachusetts Government Act, which made it illegal for Massachusetts government to be local. It was under the direct rule of the crown. And they wanted to do this by boycotting imported goods. Some of the southern states was opposed to this. They were heavily tied in with British trade and needed it to support their economies. So this meant that ultimately a lot of the delegates did not want to enact the Suffolk plan, while people in Massachusetts did actually follow this plan, and began boycotting imported goods. We saw that with the Tea Act as well, and the Boston Tea Party. Ultimately, the plan that they did decide on and they did decide to go with was the Declarations and Resolves. So under the Declarations and Resolves, the Congress condemned the British Parliament and the King George III for interfering with colonial matters, and granted each colony the right to colonial treasury and legislature. So this was sent to King George and Parliament, but was ultimately rejected by the Crown. They also wanted to create a colonial association, which was just simply the name of an agreement between each of the colonies to remain united in their boycotting of British goods. That way, the one colony couldn't undermine any of the other colonies. So it was an attempt to unite the 13 colonies. Even though Georgia wasn't there, they were still trying to unite. Ultimately, though, all of these plans were a failure, and the Congress, expecting that, or not hoping for it, but just in case it did happen, did decide to meet for another Continental Congress in 1775. So this was taking place in 1774, and they'd get back together in 1775. So now we need to take a look at the general who was in charge of all of the British forces in the colonies. His name was General Thomas Gage. He himself occupied Boston when the Intolerable Acts were first initiated. In April of 1775, Gage learned of stores of gunpowder and ammunition that were being held more inland. So he marched his army to the Lexington and Concord to eliminate the threat to British rule. In response, the colonists rushed to protect their gunpowder and their munitions by using different guerrilla tactics. So if you don't know what guerrilla tactics are, they are hit and run tactics that allow for a smaller force to overwhelm a larger force. The militia that fought these British troops, were known as Minutemen, because they were ready to go and fight in a minute's notice. So that's where they got their name. Two of the most significant areas where the fighting took out was Lexington and Concord. That is where the stores of ammunition and gunpowder was believed to be, as well as just guns in general. And so as Gage and his troops marched upon Lexington and Concord, they were met with the Minutemen resistance. Ultimately, this was the first actual battle of the Civil War, and this was, again, in April of 1775. So after the First Continental Congress departs and sends all of their plans. But yeah. So this is just an image of the Continental Congress, how they were meeting in Philadelphia. They did keep them closed and private. But the whole point was to think about freedom and preserve their liberties and their rights, even if it had to be purchased with blood. But they had to be ever vigilant in their efforts to ensure that they had their natural-born rights as Englishmen. This image is just depicting the troops lining up and firing onto colonists. The British tactics at the time were definitely line up in a row, shoot the guns, reload. Next blind fires behind them. This allowed for quick and easy troop movement. However, when met with a guerrilla style, as the colonists were doing, it made for chaotic battles. So the colonists could easily get around them and flank them, shooting them from multiple different angles. This would end up breaking the British formation. As the British formation was broke, it caused a lot of issues with the organizational techniques, and so a lot of the early battles were won by the Minutemen. So after this, Gage ended up fortifying in Boston and trying to keep hold of it. So in 1775, with no resolves coming or happening, the Second Continental Congress was formed. The New Englanders wanted secession, especially Massachusetts, but Rhode Island was also in favor. Connecticut was also in favor of seceding. Southerners were still heavily wanted reconciliation. If you remember back to when we talked about religion, the South had a heavy presence with Anglicanism, which did connect them back to the Church of England, because Anglicanism is the Church of England. So they definitely did want to reconcile that relationship. The middle colonies were a bit split on whether or not they wanted to secede or if they wanted independence, or to stay loyal. Some of them that were more agricultural-based delegates did want to reconcile, while others that lived more in the city saw where things were headed, and so they were more in favor of independence. Ultimately, the Second Continental Congress did two things. One, they sent an olive branch petition to King George, which he promptly said no to. The point of the olive branch petition was to petition King George III to talk to Parliament and try and reconcile things between the colonial governments and Parliament. Parliament said no, and so they passed the Prohibitory Acts. The Prohibitory Acts were a group of acts that simply said, yo, colonies, you're officially in rebellion, and we're going to do everything we can do to stop this rebellion. But before the Second Continental Congress even got word of that, they did decide to have a declaration of cause and necessity for taking up arms. This was when George Washington was put in charge of the Continental Army, specifically the Massachusetts militia. He was supposed to have about 20,000 men, but it was a little wonky because when Washington tried to command them, a lot of them ended up deserting. We'll talk about that more here in just a second. But one of the most famous battles you actually do need to know about is Bunker Hill. It took place in June of 1775, so still before the Declaration of Independence. Bunker Hill actually took place on Breed's Hill outside of Boston. The battle was extremely costly for the American troops. However, the colonial government suffered. No, I'm sorry, not the colonial government. The British troops suffered much heavier losses. And the name of the Battle of Bunker Hill is a little bit of a misnomer because it did actually take place on Breed's Hill, which was a hill right next to it. So the British did end up taking it, but the colonists viewed it as a major victory because of how much they were able to lessen the forces of the British troops. One story that is said is that one of the commanders on top of Breed's Hill was telling his men not to fire until he saw the whites in the British eyes. That way they definitely knew that they could hit them. The guns weren't as easily loadable or accurate, so they wanted to make sure they could use all the munitions they needed. Also during the Second Continental Congress, questions of independence were beginning to rise. Nobody was really talking about it, but then John Adams brought it to the floor and said, "Hey, I want to vote for independence." People were not happy. People were very upset. They didn't know what to do. But as the debate raged on, certain delegates were like, well, let's go back to our home colony and see what they have to say, because we don't want to say something that our colonial government doesn't agree with. So this gave John Adams and his allies for secession time to rally forces behind their cause. Thomas Jefferson was enacted to write a Declaration of Independence just in case they decided to declare independence. So yeah, that was essentially the forefront of what led to the Declaration of Independence happening. The Declaration of Independence was eventually agreed upon on July 2nd. John Adams said himself that the July 2nd shall be the most important day in U.S. history. Except 2 days later is when it was actually announced to the general public, and the colonial governments didn't ratify it until August 2nd. We, of course, celebrate the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, but that wasn't actually the day that it happened. It was simply issued to the people on July 4th. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything. Oh, here's the exact quote from John Adams. The second day of July 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. So yeah, that's kind of a funny little thing with John Adams. So George Washington was ultimately put in charge of the Continental Army, and with the Declaration of Independence signed, he was finally getting some more support that he needed. But he was definitely viewed as the man at the center of the room, always there, always present. In his speech, when he accepted the appointment to lead the Congressional or the Continental Army, he was wearing his full military regalia, but he was very humble about it, like he wasn't already kind of expecting it. But that's beside the point. It's just kind of a funny little thing. So we officially do look at the American Revolution of happening from 1775 to 1783. The Declaration of Independence, again, wasn't signed until 1776, but fighting did break out in 1775, which is why we begin the American Revolution in 1775. By 1775, 2.6 million people lived in the colonies. 40% of the population ended up taking place in the fighting. So it's not as widespread as most people would lead you to believe. 25% of the population were Tories or loyalists. So in some respects, the American Revolution was a civil war. Anti-British patriots fought pro-British loyalists. Of the Tories that did fight, there was almost 60,000 of them that fought alongside the British soldiers. So civil war because, it's a country breaking from another country, and that's what a civil war is. When we get to the American Civil War, it's the South breaking from the North and forming two different countries, but ultimately that failed, spoiler alert. So that's why it's called a civil war, because it is between two sides within the same country splitting up. So the American colonies were part of Britain, but now they're splitting off. Civil war. I'm way over explaining that, but regardless. With the signing of the Declaration of Independence, U.S. was officially its own country, at least according to themselves. One thing I did forget to mention about the Declaration of Independence, Georgia did end up showing up to the Second Continental Congress, and they had a unanimous vote to adopt the Declaration of Independence, with one abstaining. The delegation from New York ended up abstaining. They had ships in the New York harbor, and so they didn't want to necessarily agree to seceding, as they were fearful of retribution, and they didn't have time to talk with the delegate. Their colonial government, which is now also known as state governments, now that the Declaration of Independence is signed, all of the different colonies have to formulate their own states, and so they create state governments. So I'm no longer going to be talking about colonies, I'm going to be talking about states. So yeah, the British did have a lot more strength than the American colonists. They had more resources, they had a higher population, their army was one of the best armies in the world, as well as their navy. They did have the most powerful navy in the world. That's how they were able to stretch from the American colonies all the way over to China, Africa, India, so on and so forth. Their military was essential to imperialist Britain and their successes. The Patriots, on the other hand, had some weaknesses. For starters, they thought regionally. Massachusetts, New York, South Carolina, North Carolina, all of these different new states viewed themselves as their own country. So when we say state, we actually do mean like their own government. So if I say the state, I'm talking about the federal government as we go forward. Because we have states in the United States, but if I'm talking about the state of the United Kingdom, that would be like the federal government of the United Kingdom, or the state of France. That'd be the federal government of France. So we have a different view of states in the United States than what it's used for in the rest of the world and on the world stage. That's just kind of an important distinction. I hope that made sense. If it didn't, I apologize. It's not super important. But the biggest thing to know is that these individual states only thought regionally. And this had an effect on Washington. Being the commander of the military, he never really did have more than 20,000 regular troops under his command. He also had short supplies. He's poorly equipped, and his men were rarely paid. But the reason the army did eventually succeed was through a plan of attrition and commitment to independence movement. And attrition is just essentially, I'm going to wait it out. I'm going to make it too costly for you to keep putting in the effort. So they just had to wait and be patient and slowly try and win victories. Also, Washington, when he wanted to rally his troops to go into New York. This is another example of thinking regionally. His militia that were under him in Massachusetts would not follow him to New York because they weren't New Yorkers. They were Massachusettsians? I don't know. Regardless, they were part of Massachusetts. They weren't a part of New York. Why would I ever go to New York to defend it? So Washington did have that issue. And the last group we need to talk about is African Americans. So African Americans were heavily enslaved, especially in the South, but they were also enslaved in the North. As these new state governments did begin rising up, some of them did enact emancipation policies that ended slavery in the state. Oh, I forgot to mention one thing in the Second Continental Congress is they did actually abolish the transatlantic slave. So slaves could no longer be imported to the Americas. I did not abolish the slave trade, just the importation of them from lands beyond the United States. Washington really didn't want African Americans in the Continental Army, but Britain decided to offer any African Americans that fought alongside them freedom, so Washington eventually did do the same thing to just increase their numbers. So a little bit more about the Tories. They definitely had a heavy control of the port cities. These were the rich people in the South, as well as like New York. They controlled all of the major port cities except for Boston. Boston, of course, being the seed of rebellion and the colonies. Now in the state of Massachusetts, they also tended to be wealthy and very conservative. They were not liberal, thinking that they needed to break away from the crown. After the American Revolution ended, a lot of them ended up migrating both to Canada and Britain. The majority of the Tories were located in New York, New Jersey, and Georgia, specifically in like Savannah, New York City, Norfolk. But yeah. Another group is American Indians. They were supported by the British on the frontier. Initially, the American Indians didn't want to get involved in the party or in the politics of the war. However, over time, thanks to the encroachment of patriots on the frontier, they ended up allying themselves with Britain. Some American Indians also did fight with the Americans, but for the most part, they were supported by the British. If you want to watch a video that's decently good by the History Channel, I'm going to put a link on Schoology, and it's just going to be called The Men Who Built America, Frontiersmen. It's the first episode. It talks about this time period, specifically about Daniel Boone and his founding of Boonville and how that settlement was affected by the American Revolution, even though it was beyond the borders of the 13 colonies. It was on the other side of the Proclamation Line of 1763, which of course colonists were not supposed to be on the other side of. France was also hugely important to the American Revolution. Spain was also involved, but we don't really talk about Spain's involvement. They just got a little bit of land. But France was a big deal. The Continental Congress sent Benjamin Franklin to partition for the new government of these new states to try and get France's support. France was very reluctant to join in the efforts of the colonist or the new American country. But eventually they did, thanks to the Battle of Saratoga. You don't need to know a whole lot about Saratoga, but Saratoga was a fort that the United States Continental Army ended up capturing. And this convinced Louis the 16th to ally with the colonists. So he provided money and supplies. And in 1778, he actively supported the new American government with gunpowder and warships and troops, and even naval support. So another big weakness of the colonists is they didn't have a navy. So as they were forming this new continental government, they had to figure out how they could have navy. But when each of these states are viewing themselves as their own country, that causes a lot of issues and disagreements that could happen. Okay. I just had to check something, sorry. So, the Battle of Saratoga was the catalyst that pushed France more into the forefront of the war. Eventually, thanks to the attrition, the Treaty of Paris was eventually signed in 1783. The treaty, now there are a million treaties of Paris. So when we talk about the treaties of Paris, we need to talk about the Treaty of Paris specifically 1783, because there are too many treaties of Parises. So Treaty of Paris 1783. You have to know the year for this one. The Treaty of Paris did a couple important things. One, Britain recognized the colonies' independence. They are no longer colonies, they are United States of America. It also established the boundary lines along the Great Lakes and all the way westward to the Mississippi River. That would be the westernmost boundary. They also were able to secure rights for fishing off the coast of Canada. Americans would have to pay any debts they owed to British merchants. This was important for Britain because they wanted to at least protect their own economic security, and so the Americans did agree to that. And if you were a Tory in colonial America, the government of the United States of America had to honor any claims that loyalists had for property that might have been confiscated during the war. So this helped protect those Tories that were still living in the United States now. So here's just a map, and you can see the breakdown of the colonial of where loyalty and opposition was held. Predominantly, as I said, in those port cities, Savannah, Charlestown, Wilmington, Norfolk, New York. Those were a lot of the loyalist strongholds. Meanwhile, a lot of the Patriot strongholds was out further west, away from the urban centers, where more people didn't have as heavily impact by the British economy. The cities definitely thrived thanks to the British economy, while those rural farmers were less impacted. So they were more willing to fight against them. They didn't have as much need for that security, economic security, by staying allied to Britain. Now, they still had heavy trade presence with Britain, so some of the frontiers were heavily contested. You can see in North and South Carolina that it was fought over dramatically between loyalist and patriot causes. But yeah. Let me go to the next one. One of the strategies of the Britain was to create a blockade all the way from the south to the north, and so they used their superior navy to try and blockade and choke the supply lines off to the American forces. But when France got involved, they were able to push inward to try and help resupply the colonists. All right, so what you need to do now is, here is a writing warm-up. I want you to write this SAQ. There is a thing on Schoology for this SAQ. Remember, when you are writing an SAQ, use your formula. Identify, define, and explain. You only have, if it says identify, you only have to identify. If it says define or describe, then you have to define/describe as well as identify. Identify first, though. If you have to explain, then you need to identify, define/describe, and explain. You're more than welcome to use any notes, any references, anything you want to write this SAQ. And the SAQ is going to be about this image. If you don't know what this image is, it is the Boston Massacre. I am telling you, this image is of the Boston Massacre. Sorry, I forgot to swipe over. The Boston Massacre. Here's the question. So briefly describe one point of view about the British in the image. Briefly explain one historical cause which led to the event depicted in the image. And briefly explain one historical event which resulted from the event depicted in the image. So, remember, there is no identify, but you still need to identify a proper noun. The question is asking, describe one point of view, describe one specific historical, briefly explain one historical significant effect. So, please use your knowledge and your proper nouns that might have been highlighted in this or in previous readings or PowerPoints or whatever. Just make sure you are identifying, describing, and explaining. You have time to do this. So, with that in mind, I will be grading it for accuracy. Please use the formula. Remember, identify, you only need one word. Describe and define, or one word, one sentence. Describe and define, you also only need one sentence, but you need one sentence per proper noun. Does this prompt give us more than one proper noun? No, it doesn't give us Britain and Spain. It doesn't give us North American colonies and Britain. So describe could only be one sentence. And explain just needs to make sure you connect back to the question. And it can, again, only be one sentence. So for B and C, if you only write 3 sentences, I'm telling you that's enough, assuming you answered the question properly. As long as you identify a proper noun to discuss, and then you describe that proper noun appropriately, and then you just simply have to connect it back to what the question is asking. A historical effect which resulted from the event depicted in the image. A historical cause which led to the event depicted in the image. So, that is what you have to do now. Go forth, I believe in you, and have an excellent weekend.